Hello everyone and good evening. I'm Don Arleth and you're watching World News Tonight, coming to you live from Warsaw. The G7 summit in the shadow of missile attacks in the Middle East and in Ukraine. Donald Trump's tariffs are also a major bone of contention. Will the West manage to maintain unity? We'll have more on that in just a moment, but first, the latest headlines. Hungary and Slovakia oppose ending Russian gas imports. Poland first in EU to evacuate its citizens from Israel. And a monument dedicated to the victims of German aggression in Poland was unveiled in Berlin. Expectations are low, but the stakes are extremely high. The 51st G7 summit kicked off in the resort town of Kananaskis, Alberta, in the Canadian Rockies, where the conflict between Israel and Iran will be high on the agenda, addressing the trade war launched by U.S. President Donald Trump, and the war in Ukraine will not be overshadowed by the conflict in the Middle East. Pavel Trzaskowski has the details in this report.
As leaders of the G7 member states convene in Canada, hopes for the summit's final outcome seem fairly modest.
From the Canadian side, I think the primary objective is not to have a blowout like it did in 2018.
The G7 meetings are held annually, with the host rotating between member states. And it was 7 years ago, also in Canada, when tensions ran high, largely because of a tariff dispute between the US president and Canadian Prime Minister. Eventually, what was mainly left from the summit was this iconic picture, taken just before the US president cut his visit short.
Now, there is, of course, a diversity of opinions when it comes to charting the path forward.
This year, the path forward is charted through topics such as the Iran-Israel conflict, war in Ukraine, or global trade and US tariffs. And for the majority of these issues, the eyes of many world leaders are focused on one man.
It is important for Donald Trump to have the perception that he's the one who is leading and he has some wins.
Some experts suggest that bilateral meetings between the leaders are more important than the agenda itself. And one of these meetings is to be held between the US president and the Ukrainian president, only their third in person.
One of the questions that I will discuss with President Trump during the meeting is the defense package that Ukraine is ready to buy.
Such a deal could reassure that the US will keep its involvement in the conflict, an outcome welcomed in many European capitals, as it would allow Kyiv to continue opposing Russia and therefore stay on its pro-Western course.
Either the leaders in Kyiv will look toward Warsaw and Washington and then we'll have a good ally on our side, or they will look toward Moscow, and that's the biggest threat to Poland at the moment.
But Donald Trump has shown volatility when dealing with this matter. Even today, prior to first talks, he said that stripping Russia of the G8 membership was a big mistake.
Didn't want to have Russia in, and I would say that that was a mistake, because I think you wouldn't have a war right now if you had Russia in, and you wouldn't have a war right now if Trump were president 4 years ago.
Therefore, he might instead look for a victory somewhere else during this year's summit. Pavel Trzaskowski for TVP World.
Hungary and Slovakia opposed a planned European Union ban on Russian gas imports, though Brussels is expected to propose the law on Tuesday, which could pass without their approval. The European Commission aims to ban all Russian gas and liquefied natural gas imports by the end of 2027. On Tuesday, it will propose measures and set out how it will legally enact the plan, which was announced just last month. Our Brussels correspondent Alex Cardier has more.
Well, Budapest may be presenting it as a veto. We've heard the Foreign Minister of Hungary, who was at this meeting of EU energy ministers, presenting it, saying that energy is a national competency, that is a responsibility of the national governments, not of the authorities here in Brussels. But this new ban on Russian oil and gas in the European Union, that is due to kick in 2027, is actually going to rumble on, because it is seen as a trade measure, and of course trade in the European Union is the responsibility of that European Commission behind me. And therefore, unless there was a blocking minority, as in enough member states were blocking it alongside Hungary, alongside Slovakia, with enough population within them to block this, this move will go forward. And it will continue beyond just this ban, even in case of a peace deal. We heard Dan Jorgensen, the European Commissioner for Energy, talking about that at a press conference just a few moments ago. He was asked, well, if there's a peace deal, will Europe start buying Russian oil and gas again? This was his opinion.
Even if there's a peace, which we all hope there will be soon, that would not lead to us starting to import Russian gas again. That would be a very unwise decision, because that would then just be refilling Putin's war chest with money. I think that would be to repeat the mistakes that we've done in the past.
So clearly Russian oil and gas a thing of the past here in the European Union, despite those protestations from Bratislava, despite those protestations from Budapest, protestations that many here have just gotten used to. Well, now, the European Union will be moving forward with this phase out of Russian oil and gas, without Hungary and without Slovakia. In Brussels, I'm Alex Carrier for TVP World.
Russia is illegally reloading oil at sea near Greece and Cyprus, Ukrainian intelligence claims. It's part of a so-called shadow fleet. Not only is it an environmental threat, such actions also allow Russia to hide the origin of the oil, evade international controls, and ensure its delivery to third countries, bypassing sanctions. If that isn't enough, the fleet is also used to sabotage and destroy underwater infrastructure. Natalia Oriol has this report.
An uninsured oil tanker has been conducting illegal ship-to-ship oil transfers near Greece and Cyprus since July 2024, Ukraine's military intelligence said on Monday. The vessel is linked to the Russian shadow fleet, which is used to evade sanctions imposed on Russian oil exports. International waters have become increasingly murky in recent years. The Baltic Sea has become a turbulent place on the offshore map. With the Russian shadow fleet on the horizon, global policymakers have to weather a different kind of storm. Acts of sabotage targeting critical energy infrastructure started in 2022 and correlated with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Especially after the September 2022 Nord Stream sabotage incidents took place on 3 of the 4 Nord Stream 1 and 2 trunk lines. That's when we launched this project, and we've looked at many case studies, including the Svalbard cable cut, the Nord Stream incident, Baltic Connector, the Sea Lion 1 cable, the S-Link 2 cable, and on and on and on. These sabotage incidents continue to take place in the Baltic Sea region.
The first volume of the Underwater Mayhem report includes detailed case studies of incidents that first brought the possible Russian hybrid operation under scrutiny. In January 2022, a subsea fiber optic telecommunications cable connecting Norwegian mainland with the Svalbard archipelago was cut. Then, on September 26, 2022, sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline created a large gas leak near the Danish island of Bornholm, sending shockwaves across the globe. More acts of sabotage followed, triggering alarm in the energy sector and raising security concerns. Has any improvement been made? What else could be done to address the shadow war?
So NATO Article 4 is a consultative mechanism. I mean, the last time we've seen it used was by several nations across NATO's eastern flank in response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
Well into 2025, the attacks continue to persist. On May 21st, the Polish military intervened when a vessel linked to the Russian shadow fleet was spotted performing suspicious maneuvers in the vicinity of a power cable between Poland and Sweden.
The stakeholders we have been talking to have kind of made us realize that there already is quite a bit of cooperation in the Baltic Sea, but most of it is horizontal.
Various projects have been implemented in recent months, including NATO's Baltic Sentry operation, launched at the beginning of the year to boost critical infrastructure security. Among those efforts is the Pulaski Foundation's own Baltic Resilience Initiative. The Baltic Sea is susceptible to frequent storms, but since 2022, in more ways than one.
Poland is stepping up as the first EU country to evacuate its citizens from Israel amid escalating missile exchanges between Tehran and Tel Aviv. With over 200 Poles on Israeli territory, Warsaw is launching a special convoy-and-flight operation free of charge, while urging all nationals to leave the Middle East immediately. Alexandra Bulenda reports.
We are in front of Polish Foreign Ministry that has just confirmed on Monday that escalating missile attacks between Israel and Iran have prompted an important decision. Poland is preparing to evacuate its citizens from Israeli territory and is the first EU country to formally launch such a mission. Now, the conflict between Iran and Israel continues, and for that now Polish officials are urging their nationals to leave Israeli territory immediately. Now, special evacuation arrangements are being made and include a convoy through Jordan and government-chartered flights back to Poland completely free of charge.
We assume that the evacuation will apply to those people stuck in Israel as tourists or on short-term stays. I would like to emphasize that up to this point, none of the European Union countries or other European countries have decided to evacuate their citizens. So here, Poland will really be the first.
The Polish Foreign Ministry says that there are currently 219 Polish nationals in Israel needing assistance. And with the conflict intensifying and no signs of de-escalation, authorities say that swift action is very much needed.
Every Pole, regardless of the reasons for which they found themselves in the evacuated area, has our care and has our full support. We will always do everything so that Poles can be here as soon as possible at our country's expense.
The evacuation operation is expected to begin within days as Poland moves quickly to bring its citizens home safely amid growing regional instability. From Warsaw for TVP World, Alexandra Bulenda.
As Russia continues its war in Ukraine and instability reigns in the Middle East, China is betting on the middle route for its prized Belt and Road Initiative. President Xi Jinping made his third foreign trip of the year today, arriving in Astana, Kazakhstan for the China Central Asia Summit. Central Asian countries will outline a blueprint for further cooperation, enhancing economic ties and embarking on this massive infrastructure project. Natalia Komarov has the details in her report.
Chinese leader Xi Jinping was welcomed with honors in Astana as he arrived to take part in the second China Central Asia Summit. On Monday, Xi met with his Kazakh counterpart Kassym-Jomart Tokayev for bilateral talks, while a round table involving also presidents of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan is set to take place on Tuesday. Countries in the region have become key partners for Beijing, especially due to China's Belt and Road Initiative, a grand project of rebuilding the historic Silk Road to develop land trade routes between Southeast Asia and Europe.
At the second China Central Asia Summit, heads of state will outline a new blueprint for future cooperation, opening up more room for the joint construction of Belt and Road initiatives.
China has been attempting to build up economic resilience in case of potential conflict with the United States.
China is looking forward to a day when they might actually decide they're going to invade Taiwan and try to reclaim it. The big problem with that they've been saying for years is that whoever opposed that, mostly Western nations, would block the sea routes leading to China and strangle their trade. So what China is doing in Central Asia is investing in agriculture, factories that produce spare parts and machinery.
But there is another dimension. The region with deep historic ties to Russia has been steadily opening itself to attract investments from other parts of the world. Especially the biggest republic, Kazakhstan, is seeking more independence from Moscow.
There is a movement to switch to their own languages from Russian language. So still Russian language is used in the big cities. But the younger generation is speaking more and more Kazakh.
The China Central Asia Summit is not expected to bring about any groundbreaking new deals, but it does show the growth of Chinese power, especially soft power. For TVP World, Natalia Komarov.
Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced on X that the national carrier, Lot Polish Airlines, is purchasing 40 Airbus A220 aircraft. Tusk said it was the airline's largest investment ever and would allow the airline to become a leader in the European air transport market. Lot's order for 40 Airbus A220s marks a decisive turn in the airline's strategy. The contract covers 2 variants. 20 of the aircraft are designed for a 100 to 135 seat market, and 20 have a seating capacity for up to 160 people. LOT still has an option to purchase up to 44 more of the aircraft, and deliveries are scheduled to begin in 2027. Airbus, a European aerospace company, won the tender following a lengthy battle with Embraer, a Brazilian competitor. A LOT executive said that the new planes will allow the carrier to explore new opportunities for development and growth. Deliveries, of course, of the new aircraft will start in 2027. On Monday in Berlin, a memorial was unveiled, a temporary but powerful tribute to the millions who suffered under German occupation in Poland between 1939 and 1945. More than just a simple stone and plaque, the site invites reflection on shared history still marked by pain. It's part of a larger plan to create a permanent space for remembrance and dialogue between two nations. Our correspondent Sasha Farbach was there and brings us this report.
Now, it's all about location. Now, this temporary monument very much attesting to the guilt of Germany and to the terrible crimes committed by the Germans during World War II against Poland. Now, it's also about political significance and that location, just a few meters away from the federal chancellor here. Also, just down the line, maybe about 200 meters to the German parliament. And also the place itself. In 1939, the Kroll Opera House, that's exactly the spot where Adolf Hitler made that announcement to the German government and the people that he was going to be attacking Poland. So the significance is there. Now, it is temporary. Now, all those officials attending, including the mayor of Berlin, also former head of the German parliament, Mr. Thierse, and also the former foreign minister, Mr. Heiko Maas, as well, and many other dignitaries. But also on the Polish side, a minister of culture, Mr. Wróblewska.
This monument is a responsibility that involves courage to look back without avoiding difficult issues, without remaining silent, and without forgetting.
The monument is not just a monument to lay flowers and the rest. It is the rock to provoke interest in the fate of so many victims in your country. But it's even more than the war and the terror and the victims. It's the knowledge about Poland.
At the same time, there's still much that binds these two countries. Also, we heard that as well, be it from NATO to the European Union to its policy on Ukraine. But this particular temporary monument is something that has huge symbolism and value, but is only a first step. We'll see more in the future, but it also means that it's only possible when really addressing the past to reach a future together. And Sasha Farbach for TVP World in Berlin.
The three-day G7 summit kicked off in Canada on Sunday. Besides 7 top developed economies present at the summit, leaders from other nations, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, will attend as well. Now, joining me to discuss the elephant in the room for this year's summit is Ian Begg, professor and economist at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Hello, Professor, and thank you very much for joining us on World News Tonight.
Good evening to you.
Good evening. Now, we have 3 wars, 2 hot ones in Ukraine and the Middle East, and a global trade war that is constantly brewing. What do you think is the single most important issue at this year's G7?
Well, I think what would have happened is that Canada would have had a very nice agenda, and it would have been thrown out the window because of what's going on in Iran, with the flights from the bombing coming from Israel and the retaliation by the Iranians. So that will have derailed all the pre-planned discussion. That said, I'm sure they will try to look at the wars. They'll be trying as well to think about the economic prospects for the global economy. There'll be a caution around what to say around and to Donald Trump, given his prickliness on some matters that pertain to the economy. And there will also be attempts to open doors to other parts of the world. You mentioned Zelensky being invited as a guest, but there are other guests, including the Indian Prime Minister and the South African President.
Yes. Now, in terms of trade, when we look at this trade war that is brewing, and of course we don't know exactly where it's taking us here in the European Union, the EU seems ready to accept 10% tariffs on European goods and will reduce import duties on U.S. manufactured autos and might remove some other barriers to cars imported from the United States. Do you think that this indeed will satisfy Washington? And how might this affect U.S.-EU trade?
It might satisfy Washington, but I very much doubt it will be the final word from the White House, which has a dynamic of its own in relation to these negotiations. It's very hard to tell from today until tomorrow what the White House is going to say is the next step. It's not so long ago since we heard that he was proposing to increase to 50% the tariffs on Europe. So we just don't know what's going to happen next with such an unpredictable president.
Well, Trump placed the self-imposed deadline of July 9th to make a deal with the United States, or he will slap 50% tariffs on EU goods. So if there is no deal in place, what would this do for the EU economy and for bilateral trade?
Well, what it will certainly do is freeze the trade. Tariffs at the level of 50% are not quite, but nearly a complete blockage on exporting to that country, because if you increase your price by 50% because of the cost of the tariffs, you're not going to sell very much. So it's something that everybody would hope would be diminished when any sort of deal is done. But the other direction, which is something that I understand the Canadians were trying very hard to push, was to say, right, we have the Americans going in one particular direction. What about the G6? That's the rest of us, with some of our guests, like the Indians, thinking in terms of operating outside the format of the G7 and trying to construct a new trading arrangement, which may well include China, for the rest of the world.
Right. And actually, when we look at Canada, it's quite interesting to see Canada is trying to build pipelines to its shores so that it can export oil to other markets. It's wholly reliant on the United States to buy its oil, and it subsidizes its oil to that extent. Now, I'm wondering here in Europe if like you mentioned, if indeed the 50% tariffs basically blocks all trade, could Europe perhaps look to another big player and maybe even look to China to fill this gap?
Well, you won't fill the gap, not least because China is a very successful exporter, and the trade balance between Europe and China is not very much in Europe's favor. China is a difficult market to crack. It has its own restrictions on imports. So the idea that you can substitute other parts of the world, especially very quickly, for what might well be lost with the US is far-fetched. I think it will be a slow process, and it may well be that Europe is going to have to go through some form of painful adjustment, which could involve tipping into recession if the threats coming from the White House materialize. The trouble as always is we just don't know what the end game from Trump is going to be and whether the tariffs that are eventually imposed will be anything like the severe levels we're talking about. They've already been downplayed in the outline negotiation with China from well over 100% to much more reasonable levels, which permit trade still to go on.
The UK had the largest trade contraction in 2 years. What was that, in April of this year? What do you think is still needed in this US-UK trade agreement?
Well, there are big areas which are outside the trade agreement, particularly the automobile exports, where the UK has been relatively successful. But the UK is also a net exporter of services, as indeed is the US. And for the UK's economy to do very well, it would hope to do far more on exporting financial, business and other services, which in many ways outshine some of the manufacturing sectors, which have been the UK's main exports in the past.
The World Bank says that in the next 5 years, it will be the worst economic times, or in economic terms, since the 1960s. If that's true, what can we expect in terms of performance? And if GDP goes down, will Europe be able to afford this vast spending, this 5% on its military?
Well, 5% on the military can be afforded if you choose to cut other forms of expenditure. And the main pressure will come on the welfare state budgets, which, as we all know, are very high in the European Union, indeed across Europe. But that never comes easily. If you try to remove the benefits that people obtain from the welfare state, they're going to object. So you can see a lot of friction in the pipeline if this shift towards military expenditure is at the expense of normal welfare budgets. It can be done, it just will be painful. But I think we should not get ahead of ourselves here. We haven't yet seen the imposition of tariffs on the scale that Trump has threatened. And my guess, and that's the best you can do with Trump, his guess, is that it will not materialize in the form that he's proposed.
The U.S. and Japan are said to be on the cusp of making a deal. Well, do you think that this could serve as a model for other countries doing negotiations with the United States?
Well, there are deals in progress and deals not concluded all over the place because Trump is trying to reorganize trade with every single trading partner. As you mentioned earlier, the UK has an outline deal. China has an outline deal. Therefore, it's not clear that what Japan manages to obtain will be any different from those kinds of deals, except in one respect. Both China and Japan have, for a long time, run trade surpluses vis-a-vis the United States, and that has been one of the motivations for Trump to try to correct it by using the very blunt instrument of tariffs. That's not been the case for the UK, which has been more or less in trade balance with the US.
Well, which brings us back to the G7. To what extent do you think this year's G7 will be a series of bilateral meetings between leaders and Donald Trump as opposed to a traditional G7 summit?
Well, these bilateral meetings go on all the time in the background. You have to think back to 2018 when there was a ganging up on Trump led by Angela Merkel. There's a famous picture of her standing up, berating him while he's sitting down looking rather shocked and various other leaders looking on. There'll be all kinds of discussions going on. I'm sure Trump will say, what is the European Union doing here being represented? Because he doesn't like the European Union leadership. He may get on better with Friedrich Merz than he did with his German predecessors. So that's the basis for the newcomers to try to do deals. He gets on very well with Giorgia Meloni, so she will have an influence in both the Italian-American bilateral deals, but also in trying to make the case for the European Union. There'll be all sorts going in. And at the same time, leaders like Mark Carney in Canada will be trying to do bilateral discussions with the Brits, with the French, with the Germans, and maybe even with the European Union leaders to say, how do we navigate this very difficult threat to all of us?
Now, do you think, speaking of the EU, Trump has talked about the value-added tax, wanting the European Union to somehow do away with this because he says it makes American products less competitive in Europe. But the European Union said, or the European Commission has said that they are not interested in doing this. Is there another mechanism that could alleviate American concerns or increase imports from the United States without doing away with the value-added tax?
Right, here I'm just going to be blunt, because what it shows is Trump's economic illiteracy. The value-added tax is imposed equally for anybody selling within the EU market, including exporters like the US, but including internal shifts, internal movements, for example, from Poland to Germany or even within Poland. So there are value-added taxes is a very reasonable way of trying to impose a sales tax. The Americans have sales taxes, but they tend to be imposed at the state or locality level. If you go to New York, you'll find that you have a hotel bill of, say, it's expensive there, $500. Then you get local sales tax, state sales tax, and then you're expected to add a tip. So your $500 very rapidly becomes $700. It's a sales tax. Tariffs are sales tax. So there are all different ways of doing similar things, which is extracting money from consumers in their capacity as taxpayers.
Indeed. Now, talking about the price oil caps on Russian oil, if you could just very briefly, any expectations from this G7 meeting that they will agree with the United States to lower the price caps?
I think there's a good chance that will happen, but we have to look as well at what's going on in the Middle East. Already as a result of the Israel-Iran conflict, you've seen a spike in the price of oil. If Iran were to react by closing the Straits of Hormuz, preventing exports from major exporters in the Gulf, that could see a further spike in oil prices. So it's very much up in the air what's going to happen to oil prices. And if you were to try to predict oil prices, you'd probably be on a losing streak.
Probably. Professor Ian Begg, of course, from the London School of Economics, economist. Thank you, sir, very much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Good night.